Delano was founded at the advent of the railroad in 1868, later becoming the chief village of Wright County. It is situated in the heart of the Big Woods, 40 miles from St. Paul and 30 miles from Minneapolis. It has a busy population of 600 or 700 and has the usual business establishments, such as hotels, stores, shops, mills, wheat market, law offices, etc., and a well-organized fire department. Surrounding the town is a farming region of unsurpassed fertility, which is being rapidly reduced to cultivation by a class of people noted for industry and thrift. Instead of the mushroom prosperity so common and eventually so disastrous in new railroad towns, the village has hardly kept pace with the growing wants of the adjacent country, and there is room for more capital in almost every branch of business. Hardwood lumber, wagons and buggies, plows, furniture stock, etc. are the principal articles of manufacture, all for which might be greatly extended with profit. The 2 schools, 4 churches, and several other societies are in a flourishing condition. In a word, there is no better point in the state in which to invest capital or earn it, to build a home and to enjoy it, to lead a useful and profitable life and to reap the reward which attended. It seems appropriate to begin this brief history of Delano and its surrounding community of Franklin Township with a glimpse at prehistory, with some idea of what was here before man came to view the area and to record his observations. Back before the Big Woods stood, ice covered the Crow Valley. 25,000 years ago, great continental ice sheets flowed out from a center near Hudson Bay, covering most of North America, down to the valleys of the Missouri and Ohio rivers. The glaciers slowly spread out, pushing soil and rock ahead of them, forming mounds called moraines. The Grantsburg lobe of the Kewaduk icefield pushed up the several moraines that cross Wright County. Melting water from the glaciers drained into the Mississippi from the moraines on the northeast side of this large finger of ice. Glacial drainage once flowed over the small plains of sandy gravel that lie along the Crow River Valley. Large mammals, such as the woolly mammoth and Arctic musk oxen driven down by the ice caps, ranged as far south as Minnesota. The first human beings to enter this locality were probably Indian hunters who came into the region when plants and animals began to thrive after the glaciers retreated. The earliest date of man's migration to Minnesota is not known, but state archaeologist Eldon Johnson is certain that descendants of earlier migrants from Asia who had entered the New World via the Bering Strait region gradually made their way to Minnesota from the west and south, probably after 8000 BC. Much of the history of these people who lived before the dawn of written records is a mystery. Their only records lie buried in the earth. Numerous mounds exist in Minnesota, some near Delano and throughout Wright County. They are found mostly on the banks of streams and lakes. The mounds vary in size. They may be round or elongated. The early theory that the mounds were constructed by people called mound builders who were unrelated to the Indians of the region has been debunked. Archaeologists now say that later they were used by recent tribes such as the Sioux. Some of the mounds which have been opened near Delano do not appear to contain human remains. But state archaeologist Eldon Johnson says of the Minnesota mounds in general, there is no doubt about the purpose they served. They were graves. Unfortunately, many of the 10,000 burial mounds which did exist in Minnesota have been destroyed. Important archaeological resources have been lost. Just when the Dakota or Sioux reached Minnesota is not known. Only future archaeology can answer that question. When the first white men came to this region in the 17th century, most of what is now Minnesota was held by the Sioux. In the mid-1700s, the Chippewa, moving westward from Lake Superior, drove the Sioux to the country west of the Mississippi and south of the Crow Wing River. War followed as the Sioux continued to be pushed south. In 1772 and 1773, battles were fought near the mouth of the Elk River, a few miles from what is now Wright County. In 1825, the Chippewa and the Sioux established a boundary line between their hunting grounds. The agreement was not well observed. When Wright County and much adjoining territory west and south of the Mississippi was ceded to the United States by treaties of Mendota and Traverse de Sioux finalized in 1853, Wright County was opened to white settlement. As trappers, traders, farmers, and shopkeepers moved into the big woods, a culture, centuries old, began a rapid decline. In a few years, it would face extinction. Where are they now, those hunters who intermittently ranged the big woods? Shortly before he signed the treaty in 1851, Wabasha, head chief of the Metawakantons, rose and said, "You have requested us to sign the papers, and you have told these people standing around that it is for their benefit, but I do not think so. In the treaty, you have said a lot about farmers, schools, physicians, traders, and half-breeds who are to be paid out of our money. You have named a place for our home, but it is a prairie. Perhaps some of those who are here will name a place we will all like better." Once the big woods was no longer the undisputed hunting ground of the Indians, it became inviting to the settlers. By 1850, a trading post had been established by Edmund Brissett at the west end of Lake Pulaski for the purpose of obtaining pelts from the Winnebago, who then ranged over that area. Brissett and his associates cut a crude road from Lake Harriet and Lake Calhoun to Buffalo. The post was abandoned in 1855, but the road remained to serve the early settlers. According to the account recorded in the History of the Upper Mississippi, published in 1881, the first people to settle in the area, which was to become Delano, traveled to Greenwood, and from there followed the Crow River to the place where their claims were selected. They might have used the road cut by Brissett to arrive at Greenwood. James P. Lyle, a Nova Scotian, was the first settler to claim land lying partly within what is now the city of Delano. Accompanied by James Patton, he arrived on June 15, 1855. In July, Patton and Lyle were joined by J. C. Ellis and S. Patton, who were also from Nova Scotia. The Ellis claim consisted of most of the land Delano was to occupy later. David White arrived in December of 1855 and lived for the remainder of that winter with Lyle in his small but comfortable claim shanty. White was later to build a claim shanty adjoining Ellis. One half of this duplex shanty was situated on each man's claim, and it was in this unique structure that the first school sessions were held in 1858. It was among the earliest schools in Wright County and probably came into being because the natural route of travel along the Crow brought children in from claims nearby. Mr. Ellis, the teacher, was paid by subscription. Among the very early settlers in 1856 were Luther V. Walter from Maine, Riley Sturman, and John and Luther Cunningham, who took claims along the Crow. Settlers came in yet greater numbers in 1857. On August 7, 1856, the first child, Ida Mae Patton, was born in the little settlement. Riley Sturman and Louise Murphy were the first couple to be married in the community on December 25, 1857, and the first death was that of Mary Lyle on December 1, 1858. She was the wife of Delano's first settler. Life for the early settlers, even under the best circumstances, was exhausting and rugged. There were the ordeals of cutting timber, building houses of logs, and sharing work at the crude sawing operation that was carried out at Lyle's place. Taking turns, the settlers were sometimes able to cut as much as 200 feet of rough lumber a day, manning systems that had one man standing in a pit beneath a log and one above to operate a crow-cut saw. Roads were poor. The settlers traveled to Watertown and Rockford in Indian canoes or dugouts, but navigating a loaded canoe was difficult. Roads went through to Watertown and Rockford in 1858, making it possible to bring some lumber in from mills in those towns. Beyond the struggle to build houses, to hack small fields out of the woods, and to secure provisions, other problems beset the settlers. Grasshoppers plagued Franklin Township in 1856 and 1857. A financial crash occurred in the fall of 1857. Most of the settlers had no money to pay for their claims at the time of the land sale of 1859. They were battered by rain, hailstorms, heat, and drought. An Indian outbreak swept the state in August of 1862, causing the settlers to flee to the stockades at Rockford, Greenwood, and Minneapolis. They fled again in 1863, and farming suffered in their absence. The plentiful ginseng root probably saved a number of the pioneers from despair and financial ruin. In 1859, a Mr. Bain from Virginia arrived in the area to promote the ginseng trade. The story has it that the enterprising Mr. Bain at first paid the settlers 4 cents a pound for a product he in turn sold for 8 cents a pound. Ultimately, he agreed to raise the price to 8 cents a pound. Local revenue increased in 1861 when Mr. Bain left the area, and the business was taken over by local merchants. It flourished well into this century. Wright County was divided into townships in 1858. Township 118, Range 25, was designated as Newport. Since there was a town named Newport in Washington County, residents petitioned to have the name changed. The commissioners named it Franklin. The first town meeting was held at the White Home, May 11, 1858. Although Franklin contributed a number of volunteers during the early Civil War years, the quota was not reached and the draft was imposed. It was decided that a bounty would be paid to encourage enlistment. New officials who refused to pay the bonds issued for the bounty came into power. Smallpox broke out in 1872. Stricken households were quarantined and the roads closed. The house of F.J. Bauman became a hospital. The only death was that of Bauman, who sacrificed his life as the result of being a good neighbor. The first bridge over the South Fork of the Crow River in Franklin Township was built in 1859 near William McKinley's. The first store saloon in the township, located on the Waverly Road, was opened in 1866 by John Marth. In 1871, Mr. Marth moved his store to Delano. By 1868, steel rails extended west from Minneapolis to reach the present site of Delano. A new influx of settlers arrived in railroad coaches. Coaches fitted with unpadded wood seats and devoid of heat in winter. Some new settlers probably stepped onto the platform at the end of the line, cold and sodden from water that seeped into the coaches during wet spells. This early mass transit, crude as it was, offered the ultimate in refinement to settlers used to ox carts and dugouts and long trips to the city on foot. The railroad increased the rate of settlement and changed the lives of those already established on farmsteads cleared from the woods in southeast Wright County. When the main line, 1st Division, St. Paul and Pacific Railroad, reached the claim sites clustered beside the Crow River, Mr. Ellis sold 20 acres of his claim to Breed, Atwater, and Pate, who were connected with the railroad. He sold 17 acres to Lyle and donated 6 acres to the railroad to be used as depot grounds. The land was platted. A little later, the remainder of Mr. Ellis's claim was purchased by W.B. Litchfield. The handful of rude claims by the river became a village called Crow River, and a post office called Crow River Station was established in a small store kept by F.B. Hopkins. The local population was not happy with the name Crow River. After much discussion, they decided to rename the village for Francis Roach Delano of Massachusetts, the enterprising superintendent of the railroad. The legislature of 1870 acted to legalize the name change. 6 years later, on February 11, 1876, the village was incorporated. The railroad brought large numbers of German and Polish people into the Big Woods country. Some were workers on the road earning $1.75 per day. Some came looking for adventure or a new place to set down roots. Seeing the lush timber as evidence of rich soil, many decided to stay on and take up farming. Whereas colonial Americans and Scandinavians predominated in most areas of Wright County, settlers in Delano and Franklin Township were mostly of German and Polish origin. The advent of rail service and the growing population brought businessmen and tradesmen who began fledgling commercial ventures in the newly established village. About the time that the railroad was being built, William Wesson began keeping one of the first small stocks of goods for sale. Minor Ball had a hand in several early businesses, one of which was a general store he built, which was managed by Frank Nichols. Warren Ames built one of the earliest saloons. In December of 1868, the Great Northern Hotel appeared just west of where the Delano State Bank now stands. It wasn't built there. It appeared when Minor Ball moved one of the old Greenwood buildings in and furnished it as a hotel. An addition was added in the spring. Colonel James D. Young purchased the hotel and made it into one of the finest on the railroad line, known for its excellent food and ample accommodations. By 1879, the Great Northern had been expanded to include 40 rooms. It was a popular rest for salesmen and travelers who arrived by rail and rented livery rigs from the management to make their calls at Watertown, Mayer, New Germany, Lester Prairie, and Winstead, towns not served by railroads. Much later, the old Great Northern became the Pfeiffer Hotel, and lastly, it became an apartment dwelling. By 1975, it was demolished to make room for the new State Bank of Delano. In 1869, the Epple brothers arrived in town and built a large general store just west of the Great Northern Hotel on the corner of Railroad Avenue and River Street. Railroad Avenue was to serve as Delano's chief commercial area until the turn of the century. The Epple partnership was dissolved in 1871. Valentine continued in the original business until 1875. Charles moved a building from the south side of the railroad to the corner of Bridge and River Streets and engaged in one of the most successful businesses in the village. It later became the home of Lundine's men's store. John Hafner managed the first hardware business in the village for the Lucas brothers, supplying necessary implements to hardy settlers who came to clear, then break the land. The wares were crude: shovels, picks, and axes. At first, saws were not to be had. Hafner later purchased the Lucas stock, and in 1879 he built a large store on River Street. On July 4th, 1869, the frame for Delano's first grist mills was raised on a spot by the river 2 blocks south from where the post office stands today. Minor Ball and E.D. Barnett were the proprietors. How the settlers must have welcomed the convenience of having their grain ground locally at the fine new mill with 2 run of stone. For early day farmers, a trip to the mill was a festive occasion. Wagons laden with the precious grain harvest clustered at the mill to deposit the raw grain and await the return of freshly ground flour that could keep a family from starving until the harvest of next year's crop. Sometimes entire families traveled to the mill to picnic and socialize with neighbors while the grain was being ground. A sawmill adjoined the grist mill, providing a ready supply of planks for flooring and walls. One power team operated both mills. 2 steam engines were used, one of 25 horsepower and another of 45. Much later, in 1895, Delano's first electrical power plant was located near the site of the mill in a little red brick building. Older residents recall how the power was turned off promptly at 11 o'clock each evening. A later flour mill was run by Les and Everett Bartlett on the site now occupied by the Granite Works. In 1872, a newspaper called the Big Woods Citizen began to lend an influence to the community. For many settlers, this paper brought the only news of state, national, and international events. It contained local news, serialized fiction, and a healthy dose of editorial opinion. In 1881, the name of the paper was changed to the Delano Eagle. This paper has served the community continuously since its inception in 1872. Among the early businesses which began on Railroad Avenue was the general store of Louis Roche, established in 1873. Several attractive and functional brick buildings were erected along Railroad Avenue during the 1880s. In 1883, the Delano Eagle moved from a little frame building on 3rd Street into the brick building it now occupies. And in 1885, Mr. J. W. Lindsley moved his hardware business into a brick building across 3rd Street from the Delano Eagle building. Later, it was converted into a hotel. Today, it is an apartment dwelling. The brick building on the corner of Railroad Avenue and 2nd Street dates from the same period. It housed the Wright County Bank, founded by C. M. Dittman and C. G. Rusin in 1880. Rusin bought out Dittman in 1882 and continued the business as a private bank until 1908, when the Wright County Bank was incorporated under state banking law as the State Bank of Delano. Most of these early brick buildings were built from bricks made near Delano. The year 1881 brought a small but noticeable surge of business expansion. John Lowmiller, the jeweler, came to town, and by 1884 his business had grown enough to warrant a new building on a corner of Railroad Avenue. A company of citizens united in 1881 to build a circular elevator that could store 32,000 bushels of grain and was powered by a 15-horsepower engine. It was also in 1881 that Whitman and Johnson arrived from Wayzata to open a drugstore on Railroad Avenue between 2nd and 3rd Streets. A year later, A.W. Whitman bought out his partner. The neighboring Peters General Store also began in 1881. The 2nd story of Peters' store served as a hall for the Oddfellows and the Masons. Prior to 1882, Delano had no harness shop. J.C. Hitz established a business dealing in tack and harness. In 1883, R.M. Walters, a gentleman from Nebraska, bought out the existing Chance drugstore, and William Bentz acquired the town's only furniture store and coffin warerooms from Andrew Huntsman. A new round roller skating pavilion stood as proof of that Delano was not a place of all work and no play in 1884. A 4,000 square foot structure with a floor of hard maple was considered one of the finest buildings of its kind to be found outside a large city. It was in nearly constant use for skating, theatrical amusements, dancing, and parties. Part of the structure now houses the lumber yard. The fact that 10 or more saloons found business to sustain them during the 1800s and well into the present century tells something of another local form of rest and relaxation. But they too became past history in the early 1950s when they were superseded by municipal liquor sales. Not many people remember the Cooper shop that stood 2 blocks south of the existing post office on River Street. Younger folks might even ask, just what's a Cooper shop? A cooper was a man who manufactured barrels, and barrels were essential in those days gone by. Barrels held salted meat and pickled foods, crackers and dry goods, as well as rainwater. Everybody had a rain barrel to catch soft water for washing special things. Delano also homed a pickle factory. Charles Brunko started it in 1899 after having success with a local's farmer's market. Among other things, he traded in ginseng. His business developed into a general store, a grocery store, then pickles. In 1818, 3 sons took over the plant. In 1926, son Herbert became sole owner, operating the plant until it closed in 1938. While the plant was in operation, cucumbers were a popular local crop, and the 3 varieties of pickles processed locally found their way to stores as far away as Kansas City. The first lumber yard in Delano was established in 1882 by Adam Horsch. His yards and sheds stood on the site now occupied by the Delano Municipal Power Plant. In 1909, Horsch sold his business to Midland Lumber and Coat and devoted his energy to other business and community endeavors. The millinery shop is another form of livelihood that has passed from the scene. Delano had its millinery shops as early as 1878, and the popularity of ladies' hats did not wane until sometime in the 1950s. Indeed, up until that time, women regarded hats as essential to a well-groomed public appearance. 3 sewing machine operators made custom dresses for the local ladies. The business branched into hats made of buckram or hat wire, shaped to the customer's wishes. Velvet, satin, fur, chiffon, silk, or straw braid covered the frames. Genuine ostrich plumes, feathers, jewels, buckles, flowers, and ribbons provided the ultimate in decoration. The store, known as Rosie's, was located at the current site of Reeder's Meat Market and provided stylish clothing for over 50 years. Old ways of life have disappeared, but tales remain with memories of buggy rides and quilting bees, of steamy, prancing horses harnessed to a sleigh, and the merry sound of sleigh bells in the air. It's been a long while since small boys rolled hoops along the walks and townfolk gathered after supper on the lawn to listen to the band play from the bandshell near St. Peter's Church. Young's Hotel for many years was run as the Great Northern Hotel by Mr. and Mrs. Pfeiffer. The Lindsley Hotel. Gilmer Hotel, located on the south side of the railroad tracks. The Round Elevator. Apple's Bar. The Rockford Woolen Mills Company, located in Delano. Pocreba's Bar. Borsch's General Store. Borsch's Saloon, Grocer, and Provisions. Capitol Bar. The railroad had a large impact on the growth and prosperity of Delano. With the railroad came tragic derailments and accidents, including this one of February 23, 1922. Zeebarth and Tomnitz Spreader Delivery Day. Adler's Meat Market. Delano Public School. Stalky Bus Services started with a fleet of 3 buses. Old Wagon Bridge in downtown, Bridge Avenue. A.L. Mealy's Jewelry Store. Armella Sims owned the Mellador Beauty Shop. The shop is now the Downtown Beauty Shop. Vernon Peterson opened a jewelry store in November 1945. C.P. Schaefer Building was constructed on the corner of Elm and River Street. J.B. Plattner's store in 1909. Plotnick's gas station. Wright County Bank. The State Bank of Delano opened in 1908. The bank served not only the Delano proper, but the surrounding areas, as well as residents of Montrose and Rockford. The bank has been located in several buildings before the existing building in 1975. Plotnick Blacksmith Shop. Lebowski's store opened in 1905. Clem's Bar was owned and operated by Clem Motzko, was located on River Street. It was a favorite stopping place for sportsmen who liked to talk over their experiences with Clem, himself an ardent hunter and fisherman. The Riviera Cafe specialized in home cooking and was owned and operated by Mr. and Mrs. Carl Topel, who started the business in 1941. Mrs. Topel cooked while Carl waited on customers. It was located on the corner of River Street and Railroad Avenue. The Zabel Style Shop opened in 1897. It was located on River Street. Oscar Leiter, owner of the Leiter Oil Company and the Pontiac and Buick dealer for the territory, was located on Highway 12 at the intersection of Bridge Avenue. motor company, Delano Ford Agency, was established in July of 1945 by Dave Douglas. It was located on Bridge Street across from the village playground in the old lighter garage. They were well equipped in body rebuilding and refinishing under the management of Eddie Picca. The Log Cabin Inn was owned and operated by Mr. and Mrs. Ray Moss and was a popular eating place located on the west side of Highway 12. The Log Cabin Inn was opened in 1931. In its later years of existence, it was owned by Herbert and Frances Bach and operated as the Cozy Inn and closed after the flood of 1956. Mr. and Mrs. Roy Hanson started the Hanson Bakery in 1932. The business originally was located on 3rd Street. However, after a few months, they moved downtown. It was located next to the Marshall Wells store. John Kritzek established the Delano's only early variety store in 1926. Perry Diddy opened a plumbing shop in Delano on August 1, 1944. With over 20 years of experience, Mr. Diddy was very capable of taking care of the city's plumbing needs. He was also well known in baseball circles as a coach. Lewis's Place was located on the west side of Highway 12. It was established in 1933 and was a popular stopping spot along the highway serving beer, soft drinks, and light refreshments. Mr. and Mrs. Klaus Eckhoff, proprietors of Eckhoff's Shoe and Harness Shop and Leather Store, came to Delano in the early 1940s. The shop was well equipped to handle all kinds of shoe and harness repair work. Auto dealer Tiny Bostic and police chief Corny Stein posed beside the 1955 squad car outside the Delano Ford Sales and Service Center on U.S. Highway 12 in 1961. This Ford touring car with 31 passengers was driven about 5 miles through the streets of Delano in high gear by M. E. Muckey of the Delano Auto Company on May 11, 1912. Santa stopped on 2nd Street to wish this child a Merry Christmas. Visible in the background are the Delano Ford Case Dealership and Phil Pagriba Blacksmith Shop. The Delano branch of the Minneapolis Brewing Company was located along the route of the Great Northern Railroad. The Delano Granite Works Incorporated was the largest retail monument manufacturing plant in the world, was started in 1917 by Bert Gilmer and was in operation until 1985. Mr. Gilmer started with a lone workman, half a dozen chisels, a maul, a few blocks of granite, and an idea. Owning and quarrying their own granite made it possible for them to put out the superior product. Always among the first to try new ideas, the Delano Granite Works was the second such plant in the West to install sandblasting equipment for lettering monuments and was among the pioneers in using and developing the granite saw. The Johnson Furniture Store was located on River Street, 2 doors north of the post office, and was owned and operated by G. Edward Johnson. They specialized in high-quality furniture, linoleum, paint, and wallpapers. The Hens Garage and Machine Shop was located on Highway 12. Mr. Paul Hens established the business in 1932. He was busy in the blacksmith shop welding a part for an agricultural implement. His bookkeeper, Regina Strelka, was busy typing an order for parts. The Warhol Drug was owned and managed by Andrew Warhol, pharmacist. The fixtures of Primavera, a South American wood, made this store one of Minnesota's beauty spots, offering a 30-foot fountain with adjoining chatterbox for the convenience of its customers. Mr. Warhol's knowledge of veterinary medicine and his interest in the farmer's problems enabled him to be of valuable assistance to those desiring the proper stock remedies. The store was a fine place to shop, including cosmetics, fits, stationery, and patent medicine departments. Motzko Store on Highway 12, 1928. In the photo, Charles Jr. and Charles Sr. pictured. The store was opened in 1922 and was moved to its present location in 1928 when Highway 12 was built. The original Phillips 66 service station, owned and operated by Peter Farniak, was located on Highway 12. Opening for business in 1931, the place enjoyed good business from the start. Delano Radio and Electric, owned and operated by Richard Pollock, opened for business in January 1946. Besides a big volume of repair work, they also sold radios, car radios, and general appliances. Everett Lefebvre, owner of Lefebvre's Meat Market in 1936. His market, located next to the post office, specialized in fine, fresh meats and cured meats. Sid's Grill, owned and operated by Sidney Olstad, was located on River Street across from Johnson's Furniture Store. He opened his business in May 1946. Armand Stein, owner of Armand's Barbershop, started his business in 1933. Armand started barbering as a lather boy for Charles Bach. One of the most important organizations in the community on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, is the Volunteer Fire Department. Organized in 1895, the fire department celebrated its centennial several years ago. Reeder and Schilling Meat Market, located on River Street, has been a Delano institution since 1911. Operating its own slaughtering house, which supplies butcher shops at Buffalo and Watertown, the business was well known for the fine quality meats. Today the business is owned and operated as Reeder's Meat Market and is located on River Street. Jack Schumacher, owner of the Jack Spratt store in Delano. The store specialized in fine foods at reasonable prices. Mr. Schumacher was very involved in civic organizations, and the store's more recent location was on Bridge Street. City Club Sales Company, wholesale distributors of Schmidt's City Club beer, was organized in 1927 by A.C. Pagriba and Delano businessmen since 1906. Active in state and local politics, Mr. Pagriba served on the council and as mayor for 7 years until his death in 1938. Mrs. Pagriba carried on the business with her son-in-law, E. H. Dahlheimer, who took over the active management of the business. Flammyonic amusements played an important part in local activities. A theater, off-sale, liquor store, and bowling alleys were the amusement centers for Delano and surrounding areas. The theater burned to the ground in the 1970s. The Delano Photo Studio was opened by Rex Bell in 1945. Mr. Bell sold the business in 1946 to Gordon Twetton and Franklin Bell, who changed it to the Gordon Franklin Studio. It was located on River Street. George J. Rome established the Rome Electric in Delano on July 1, 1945. Mr. Rome offered the public the following: radio sales and service, GE appliance sales and service, wire and electrical supplies for farm and home, Johnson outboard motors, fishing and duck boats, sporting goods, clothing, and a complete stock of incandescent and fluorescent lamps. The business was located 2 doors west of the City Hall on Bridge Street. The Marshall Wells store was first established in 1936 across from the City Hall until 1939, when it moved to River Street across from the Delano Granite Works display yard. The store was owned and operated by J.A. Gamble and his son, Bob Gamble. Brown's Pharmacy was originally established by Mr. A.W. Whitman in 1880. E.C. Brown and A.K. Brown purchased it from the Whitman estate. They carried anything you could ask for in drugs, cosmetics, etc. Poultry medicines, tonics, and vaccines were big items in the store. A big ice cream business was carried on, along with candy, cigarettes, and cigars. Mr. Brown opened the store in June 1937. Crumb's Barber and Beauty Shop, located on the corner of Bridge and River Street, was owned and operated by Mr. and Mrs. Leslie Crum, who took over the business from Mr. and Mrs. Ed Bach in 1941. Featuring feed grinding and mixing, the Delano Elevator Company was established in 1924. Owned and operated by the Strabicki brothers, Charles and Valentine, the business grew steadily. One of the first Fairway stores to be organized was located in Delano. Mr. Paul Cruel opened his store in 1925 and took on his partner, Mr. William Duell, in 1936. Mrs. Jacob Bakuski is shown stocking shelves. Bartlett and Kiefer, brother-in-laws and partners in 1932, owned and managed a very successful business on River Street. In 1941, the building was purchased by Boyce Funeral Parlor, and they moved their tavern across the street. Peterson's Photo Shop, known throughout the country for the fine quality of its photo finishing, was one of the pioneers in the field, having been established by Victor Peterson. It was later owned by Mr. and Mrs. John Irwin and catered to wholesale and resale customers in almost every state in the Union. Mr. and Mrs. A.J. Boyce succeeded the Tautkus funeral service in 1930. They maintained a dignified funeral chapel on River Street, where their display room was also located, and built the existing funeral home now owned by Jim and Shar Eiton on 3rd Street. Note the placement of the old water tower. Stellar's, located on Highway 12 on the west end of the highway bridge, opened for business on December 1st, 1945. They were dealers in McCormick Deering implements, International trucks, and Packard cars. Harry Zwick, owner of Zwick Motor Company, came to Delano in 1939 and opened the Chevrolet dealership on Bridge Avenue in June. The Rainbow Inn, located on Bridge Street next to the Heinen hardware store, was owned and operated by Robert Nicolai and Mr. and Mrs. Everett Zabel. Serving beer, soft drinks, and refreshments, the Rainbow Inn was a popular spot for light lunches. The Delano Cooperative Creamery was established in 1897 and became widely known almost immediately for the fine quality of its products. Delano Creamery butter won several prizes, including one at the Buffalo World's Fair. In the mid-1940s, the creamery activities were almost entirely devoted to bottling milk and cream for local as well as Minneapolis consumption. The longest established business in Delano is the Eagle Printing Company. Founded in 1872 by a group of Delano pioneers who formed a stock company that capitalized at $10,000, the organization showed steady growth. Specialists in railroad and commercial printing, the Eagle handled a great volume of work for the Great Northern and Northern Pacific Railroads, operating on one of the few rural bookbinderies in the state. The company also did a large volume of county, bank, and creamery record book printing and binding. William Heinen owned a hardware store in 1905. The Lunston Lumber Company, one of Delano's older businesses, was established in 1903. The yards were located on Railroad Avenue next door to the Eagle Printing Company. Cliff Lunston succeeded his uncle, O.J. Lunston. Later, Cliff's son and daughter-in-law, Jim and Ann Lunston, owned and operated the business. Marv Schmidt opened the Red and White store on May 6, 1946 in the former Schaefer building across the street from the Delano Granite Works on River Street. E.W. Keplinger owned a combined restaurant and grocery store in 1920 on River Street. In 1930, his son, H.E. Keplinger, known as Kep, succeeded him. The restaurant end of the business closed while the grocery store continued for many years. In 1932, a produce department was added to the store. The produce department later operated branches in Delano, Dassel, Buffalo, Eden Valley, Montrose, Watkins, Monticello, Kimball, Waverly, and Atwater. A fleet of trucks was kept on the road picking up produce and redistributing it. The main bar, one of the Northwest's most beautiful lounges, was owned and operated by Mrs. Magdalena Ferrier after purchasing the business from August Dekarski in January 1946. It was located on the corner of Bridge and River Street. The Red Owl store, located next door to the Delano City Hall, was very successfully operated here for 6 years by Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence Carl, who purchased the business from Mrs. Ella Kirsch. On June 1, 1946, the Red Owl store was purchased from the Carls by Raymond Truman, who came to Delano from Minneapolis. The last Roundup, one of the most popular eating places on Highway 12, was located where the American Legion currently stands on the west side of the corner of Highway 12 and Bridge. Besides being a popular eating spot, the last Roundup was also well known for the dances held there every Saturday night. The Roundup burned during the flood of 1965. The Delano Municipal Power Plant is a story of growth, achievement, and efficiency. Starting with water and electricity distribution, it was appraised at about $30,000 in 1932. In 1945, due to the growth and the additional service needs of the community, the plant installed 6 new unit diesel motors and generator in addition to a new 1,200 horsepower power unit, along with its completed addition in 1946. This is a view of Highway 12 and County Road 17. Lee Motors Ford. Independence Day, July 4th, was always a big celebration in Delano. The town gazebo, located by the railroad tracks, was used for many concerts. St. Paul's United Church of Christ on Bridge Avenue and Buffalo Street. Delano Churches, 1946. Heavy snows in 1964 and 1965 led to the dramatic flooding of Delano in April 1965.